Chapter 21 of Julia Ried. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Julia Ried by Pansy. Chapter 21, in which class is not considered. Abbie vexed me the very next morning at the breakfast table. I looked to see her assume an air of distant dignity toward Mrs. Tyndall. I considered that I had sufficiently explained that lady's character to make it plain that she was not worthy the friendship of my cousin. I was therefore much surprised and chagrined to notice the bright, cordial greeting that Abbie bestowed upon her, and their conversation together was frank and cordial. Apparently Abbie was interested in everything that Mrs. Tyndall said, and entered with interest, even with eagerness, into the most trivial subjects. I felt very much disgusted with them both. I concluded that my cousin, who the night before had seemed to me almost an angel, was human like the rest of the world, and, of all faults, possessed the one that I detested the most, hypocrisy. She could not certainly admire Mrs. Tyndall. Indeed, she knew that lady's whole life to be at variance with her clearly defined views of right and wrong, and yet she affected to be pleased with her. I contented myself with maintaining a haughty silence, except when I was directly addressed, and even then I made my replies as brief and disagreeable as possible, and I verily thought that I was practicing one of the Christian virtues. I felt gratified, soon after, when Abbie graciously declined an invitation to ride with Mrs. Tyndall, and announced her intention of accompanying me to the shop. "What in the world are you going to do there?" our hostess questioned with wondering eyes. "Going to get acquainted," Abbie answered, flashing back a bright, roguish glance at the astonished lady from her blue eyes. And without further explanation she joined me. I experienced no little satisfaction in walking down Regent Street with my dainty little cousin. She was very simply dressed in a neat fitting street suit of heavy gray cloth, but everything about her was in such perfect keeping, so faultlessly new and perfect, from the delicately tinted kids that matched her suit to the exquisitely fitted walking boots. And about her entire person was that mysterious, unmistakable air of culture and style, that it seemed to me if she had been labeled "direct from New York City," it could not have been more evident than it was now. There was a rustling among the boxes, and a general moving of things out of our way, when we reached the shop, that indicated the sort of impression that my visitor was making. I took her at once to my desk, and she followed my example in laying aside her things, and coolly announced her intention of spending the morning with me. I was puzzled to know what to do to entertain her. I need not have been. She had her own plans of entertainment, and carried them out. "Won't you make the tour of the rooms with me, when you have leisure, and introduce me to the girls?" she asked me suddenly, after a moment's study of the room and its inmates. I remember with what an air of amused superiority I answered her. "Why, my dear child, we don't introduce them, they never expect it; would be perfectly amazed if we did. If you want to ask them any questions about their work, you will not be obliged to wait for an introduction. Speak to whoever you please." Abbie surveyed me thoughtfully with her great blue eyes, but made no answer, and presently began to question me closely about the girls. "Julia, who is the one with hair combed plainly back, and with a little narrow collar and no bow?" "Frank Hooper. She's a character. Been spoiled, they say, by a flirtation with Mr. Sayles." "Did he flirt with her?" "I presume he did, thoughtlessly perhaps. Mrs. Tyndall says she flirted with him, but it is too great a stretch of charity to believe much that she says. Dr. Douglass says they were engaged, and that he deserted her when her father lost his property, but I don't believe that either." I said this with an air that betokened a lofty contempt for gossip of all sorts, but Abbie seemed not to have heard my last sentence. She was looking earnestly at Frank, and, as I finished my sentence, asked, "Is she a Christian?" "No, indeed, far enough from it. She is little better than a scoffer. Dr. Douglass has spasms of being deeply interested in her, but his interest doesn't seem to accomplish much." "Have you done all that you can for her, Julia?" I answered more faintly, but still steadily. "Yes, I have. I could do just nothing for her. She repelled every attempt." I was very sincere. I did not blush then, as I do now, in recalling this conversation. I firmly believe that girls of 16 haven't the slightest conception of what fools they are. Abbie's attention was by this time turned toward Caroline Brighton. She asked me as to her name, her character, the influence that surrounded her. I laughed as I answered the questions. It seemed natural for people to laugh when they talked about Caroline. "She is an embodied spirit of evil, I do believe," I said, still laughing. "She was never known to be interested in anything but mischief of the wildest and most daring nature." "What has her religious education been?" "I doubt whether she ever had any. At least, there is no present indication of any." Again my cousin's earnest eyes sought mine, and she spoke slowly and thoughtfully. "Do you think that is possible, Julia? She must have come in contact with Christian people, and they must have left their impress. For instance, she has come in daily contact with you, and of course you must have influenced her?" There was a questioning sound to her voice, but I had no reply to make. I think she had given me my first realizing sense of solemn responsibility. It was a new thought that my life, this past winter, must have been contributing to the religious education of Caroline Brighton. It was not a pleasant thought. I shivered under it, and spoke suddenly. "What a fearful thing you would make of life! If we can never come in contact with people without influencing them, I think most of us would pray to be delivered from people." "Or else, feeling the unmeaningness of that, pray to be so enveloped with the Spirit of Christ that our influence would tell for Him." Mr. Jerome Sayles lounged in at that moment and interrupted further conversation. He brought a bouquet of exquisite hothouse plants in glorious bloom. He made a feint of counting the blossoms and dividing equally between us. Abbie was courteously grateful, but very full of her previous subject, and appealed to him. "We are talking of influence, Mr. Sayles, Christian influence. Isn't it true that every person of whom we come in contact influences us, more or less, and, if the person be a Christian, educates us in that direction?" Mr. Sayles was amusedly interested. "I'm not posted on that subject, you know," he said good humoredly. "You must constantly remember that my education has been woefully neglected in that quarter. Won't you take me in hand and reform me?" But Abbie was persistently determined not to trifle with him, least of all on this subject. There was a sweet earnestness in her voice as she asked: "Is it really true that your Christian friends have made no impression on your mind as to their religious character, or that the impression they made has not in the least affected your life?" He became grave at once. His face even wore a troubled look as he answered: "They certainly have made marked and lasting impressions. But I have not profited by any of my lessons as I should. Perhaps you will teach me a better way of life?" If, as I strongly suspected, he was saying this for effect, my cousin was by no means disposed to talk sentiment with him, but turned promptly to another topic. "Mr. Sayles, are you acquainted with all these girls?" There was a glance of surprise at the sudden change of subject, a quick glance toward "the girls" whom the question indicated, a curious lifting of the eyebrows, a roguish look at me, all in a second of time, and he replied in his ordinary tone of indolent good humor: "I have that honor." "Then will you introduce me to each one of them?" Mr. Sayles bent an earnest, questioning look on her face, then his manner and tone changed, and he said in a serious, quiet voice: "Certainly I will, if you wish it." Abbie immediately arose, shook out the folds of her dress, and prepared to accompany him. They went at once toward Frank Hooper's corner, leaving me, meantime, in a state of absolute disgust. I was enraged with my cousin, with Mr. Sayles, and, more than all, with myself. It seemed incredible to me that in so short a time I could have sunken so low as to be ashamed of introducing a company of respectable girls to one who asked an introduction, my sole reason for declining being that the said girls worked in a shop. I thoroughly despised myself. I tried to discover how I came to indulge in such miserable pride. It was not difficult to trace the influence directly to Mrs. Tyndall, and as usual I seemed to forget that I could have had any influence over my own life, or could have found help that would have kept me from falling. So I went on cherishing a fierce and bitter feeling in my heart for her. Meantime I watched my cousin. Mr. Sayles presented her to the girls with all the courteous grace that he would have used in his intercourse with any lady, and Abbie's manner was equally far removed from patronage and hauteur. She was simply her sweet, graceful self, as thoroughly composed and at ease as if this were not a novel position to her. Frank Hooper was decidedly the haughtiest and most unbending of the two. Abbie lingered longest beside Caroline Brighton, seeming to find her the most communicative and agreeable. Mr. Sayles left her with Caroline, and sauntered back to me. "She is a very singular little lady," he said, watching her as she leaned against the table, apparently indifferent to paste and brushes, and carried on an animated conversation. "I wonder you didn't give us some idea of the unusual development of character." "I don't observe anything so very remarkable," I said stiffly, in some doubt as to whether his tone expressed admiration or amusement, and being prepared to resent either with an almost equal degree of earnestness. "Don't you?" he said, and he gave me the benefit of a very searching look. "That is strange. Now, I consider her the most remarkable young lady I have ever known. She really seems to be in earnest." My indignant answer was checked by my desire to hear the conversation between Abbie and Caroline. "Will you go?" Abbie questioned earnestly. "Really," Caroline answered, assuming most admirably the air of a modest, diffident young lady, "I would go with pleasure, but you see I am not in the habit of it, and I don't know any one to go with, and I should feel so queer and strange." Then Abbie's sweet, gentle voice: "I think you told me you lived on Jackson Street. Then you have to pass through Clinton Square to reach the church, do you not? My cousin pointed out the church to me at the upper end of the square. Then couldn't you call for me? I board at Mrs. Tyndall's, you know, and I should be so glad to have your company. We might all go together from there. Will you not come?" "I might do that," Caroline answered, meekly, her eyes meantime gleaming with mischief. "I do so wish you would. It would be very pleasant to us to have you come. May I expect you then?" "I think so. Shall I ask for you, Miss Ried?" "Yes, if you please. And if you can come a few minutes before the time, we could have a little chance to get acquainted, and have a pleasant talk, perhaps." And then Abbie moved away, thanking her meantime as one who had conferred a favor, oblivious apparently to the conversation that immediately followed her departure, though I heard it distinctly. "Aren't you ashamed?" queried Caroline's next neighbor, a blunt-spoken, well-meaning sort of girl. "I wouldn't make game of any one who treated me as nice as that, I vow." "Hush," said Caroline gravely. "I'm to become a means of grace to Mrs. Tyndall. Don't you see? Imagine me seated in her elegant parlor, complacently awaiting the departure of the family for church. Isn't that jolly, though? A shop girl in her parlor! She'll have to clean house for a month after that." Then, in lower tone, but still distinctly, with a glance over her shoulder at Abbie: "Which is she, Vic, a greenie or a brick?" What was she, indeed? And where was all this to end? How would Mrs. Tyndall tolerate such introductions to her parlor? I felt troubled and provoked. "I don't know what to do with her," I said aloud and fretfully, and I couldn't decide whether Mr. Sayles' reply was intended to be soothing or sarcastic. "I wouldn't try to do anything with her, Julia. I fancy she is a person who will do for herself." There was certainly sensation enough as we lingered in the dining room that evening, and shortly after a furious ring at the front door, a servant announced: "Miss Brighton to see Miss Ried." It was almost a pity that Caroline could not have been present to enjoy the scene. "Miss Brighton? Who on earth is she?" speculated Mrs. Tyndall. "And which Miss Ried does she want? You, of course, Julia, but I don't recall the name. Have you an idea who it is?" I was in a blaze of confusion, but Abbie answered promptly and sweetly: "The message is for me, I presume, Mrs. Tyndall. It is one of the girls whom I met to day at the shop. She has come to accompany us to church this evening. I asked her to come in early. I wanted to get a little bit acquainted with her, so I will be excused at once." As the door closed after her, Mr. Sayles, whose presence was so constant now as to be considered a matter of course, studied for a moment Mrs. Tyndall's face, then burst into an uncontrollable fit of laughter. Peal after peal re-echoed through the room, and to the lady's annoyed question, "What on earth are you laughing at?" he only answered by a more hearty outburst than before. "This is as good as a first-class theatre," he said, when he could speak again. "Come, Julia, take me to meeting with you this evening. I must see the fun out." Necessity sent us all shortly after to the parlor to receive other callers, and no greeting could have been more perfect in its way than the one that Mrs. Tyndall gave to the shop girl in answer to Abbie's introduction. Chapter 22. Recording by Trisha G.